Thank you. Very happy to be here. Let's get started like this. What if I were to tell you that program project managers are the most invaluable assets to companies that are trying to achieve a strategic advantage or a competitive advantage? First of all, let me see who would agree with me when I make that statement. I just want to make sure.
Then I would say, let's talk to people that tell my salary.
Well, that was going to be the next thing. What if we actually got compensated that way? Right? There's a gap there. But if you think about it, if you truly think about it, projects typically involve capital budgeting, and they're usually aligned to some strategic objectives. So why is it that we have this gap in compensation? And I think the truth of the matter is some of us just haven't figured out how to strategically plan our initiatives and tie them to the strategic objectives and measure them such that we could demand those salaries that we really should be getting, right?
Well,
so
isn't it a good thing to be in trending, being in higher demand for the future?
Rising tide lifts all boats.
That's right. So let's have that conversation. Specifically, we're going to talk about a tool that we can use to achieve that. I think all of you have heard or have conducted a kickoff meeting, but we're going to talk about some components of a strategic workshop that are different from that I think can help us demand those greater salaries. At least I hope give you some thoughts to how we could potentially do that. So, and by the way, this conversation isn't to stroke your egos or my own, but it's for us to think about that. We're going to have some story time. We're going to talk about the significance of the strategic workshop. We're going to talk about how we get started and how we make the most of it, and then what do we do afterwards, which is very important. You don't need to know about me, but give me 1 second, this clicker is a little slow. Here we go. So, why do we need program project managers? I just spoke to that, but I do want to get some feedback from you all about why you think we need them. Anybody?
I found, at least within my organization, it helps focus other teams, different specialists that don't normally have that sort of mindset. You know, what are the goals? What's the timeline? What are the resources? You know, they just have an idea, okay, we're going to go build this, you know, or do something, and they don't think about it, you know, in a more thoughtful, you know, way.
Being strategic about managing change.
Exactly.
Hub and spokes. PM's hub, essentially connector of all the various pieces around.
I was going to say being a little more efficient by breaking it up into small pieces as you go to program manager, looking over several projects. It breaks up the work to more manageable pieces.
Right. All good answers, all good feedback. Anybody else? I'm sorry?
Just wouldn't get anything done out of it.
I love that answer.
There's an element of being able to communicate upwards to the organization about what's really going on,
True.
enabled by the PM.
True. Did y'all hear what Robert said? Could you do it one more time? I want to make sure.
There's an element of communication upwards into the organization. Otherwise, probably wouldn't exist, especially if things weren't going so well.
Right. All of these are great answers. The way I like to think about it is we drive the bus to strategy realization. Okay? We are the bus drivers to strategy realization. Again, we talked about the investments that are made in these projects that we run. And you do need someone, I think we heard the will and spoke, we heard the communication, we heard the organization breaking it down into pieces that can actually be manageable. They don't realize the strategic objective without us, right? So that's why it's important. So I'm gonna tell you guys a situation that I walked into. And to this day, it makes me laugh. arrived at a client, and I had a list of what the scope of the program was going to be. I actually decided that I would start interviewing the key stakeholders before I did anything else so that they can get to know me and I can get to know them. And I went to the leader of the architecture office and had a conversation. And as I'm talking with him, Carlos, he's smiling ear to ear. And I'm like, oh, you know, he's just a happy guy. But he would not stop smiling. And finally, it made me a little uncomfortable. I said, why are you so happy? He said, because after 3 years, they actually funded your position. And that should have drawn a red flag. That I was going to be stepping into something that was going to be really challenging. But what I did with Carlos and with all of the other key stakeholders that I met over the course of a couple weeks, I asked a very simple question. I said, Carlos, you finally got me here. We've got some budget. We're doing this. What does success look like? Carlos had an answer. Evelyn had a different answer. John had a different answer. Paul had a different answer. Right? So I knew right away that I wasn't going to be able to just jump right into tactical execution. Right? It was very clear to me at that point that there wasn't a clear understanding of why we were doing what we were doing. No one had the same view of what success looked like. And that my chances at success as a program manager were going to be very slim if I didn't do something about it right then. So I decided that we're going to have a strategic workshop. First of all, anybody else have any experiences like that? I'm sure we all have walked into something like that. There we go. So data supports the need to make sure that we're attached to the strategic goals of the organization. Think about this. 67% of organizations fail to deliver projects that meet the original goals of the business. That's a lot of waste. 80% of executives don't know whether or not their projects and programs are actually helping them align to their business strategy. How is that possible? Companies that are aligned to their enterprise strategy meet their goals 38% of the time more than those that are not. All right? So the data supports this. I think we all know from our applicable experience that it's true. So what are we going to do about it? And here's some other conditions that cause projects to fail. Are there any up here that I'm missing?
Lack of executive or management support.
Lack of clear vision.
Yep.
Or is it, okay, sorry.
No, but that's good. I want to hear feedback.
Unrealistic business case. I think a lot of times, if you're not clear about what it is you really want to build, there may be some money in the funding, in the budget. You start down one path and realize you're going down the wrong path. So I think even beyond inaccurate requirements, the unrealistic expectation of the goal that you created.
Love that. And I want to come back to that.
Okay.
I think you were spot on. Unrealistic expectations of what you can achieve in the time, I'm putting words in your mouth, but in the time that they expect you to achieve it.
Time is a big part of that, I think.
Correct.
Time constraints.
Correct. Anything else that I'm missing? There's a lot of experience in the room.
Sometimes it's the technology and the newness of it potentially. You're on the bleeding edge of something that just didn't materialize, that like you thought you couldn't deliver. All those things could be in perfect alignment. You picked the wrong tool. That's rare. This is certainly 99% of the time. But I had a project that we did and the technology just didn't work out.
Totally agree with you.
Inability to let go of sunk costs.
Inability to let go of sunk costs.
Just poor leadership.
Poor
You
leadership.
might not do a good job.
Poor leadership.
There's new technology.
Or just lack of a strategic vision at all.
Lack of the vision at all.
Right? People are just kind of doing stuff thinking that's what they need to do, but it's not aligned to anything in particular.
Absolutely. All of these are good reasons. And I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Jeff.
Jeff. what Jeff says resonates with me, and it actually feeds into everything that you guys spoke about. You can have the right construct, but if you don't have the right tools, and by tools I mean people, governance, strategic alignment, pick whatever you want to pick, you can still fail, right? So we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but those are all good feedback. So why do we need to leverage it? And the main reasons is so we don't fail, right? We do not want to be failures. We want to be able to manage through and mitigate against all of the things that we just spoke about. We want to confirm the purpose of the initiative and tie it to the strategic goals of the organization. We want to generate enthusiasm. I loved it that Carlos was smiling. It's great when you have them excited to help you and be engaged. You need to know who you're working with, right? And the funniest thing that I found out in that situation is that Carlos wasn't talking to Sarah. They're in opposite, you can throw stones between their two offices, but they're not even talking, right? So you create an environment for them to have a dialogue. You want to gain consensus on what success looks like. You want to validate the scope. You want to talk about whether that scope is realistic or not. Maybe you need to do an interim solution before you start investing tons and tons of dollars into something that they won't ever use, or something that's not really realistic, or taking a risk on something that hasn't been proven, right? You want to determine how the team is going to work together effectively. Get that up front. Understand that up front, what your engagement model is going to be like. And you want to ensure that the funding is really available for everything that they say that they really want you to do. I don't know if any of you had that situation where you really didn't have the dollars that you thought you did. And then a good component of the capabilities that you're trying to build, you can't even realize because you didn't even have the purse strings to do it. So these are the reasons why you want to leverage a strategic workshop. Now let me ask you, be very honest with me. For the kickoff meetings that you guys have had, is there anything up here that you didn't have in your kickoff meeting? Or did you guys always do this? Because if you guys have always done this, then I'll let you guys speak.
I think it's that consensus piece. Sometimes you don't know who the key stakeholders are.
True.
You're often told, I work with clients and this is your sponsor. This is the guy who holds the budget. But you don't realize that there are other stakeholders within that organization that are really funding all of that.
Right.
And you get to the end and you haven't achieved their objective. You tick off all the boxes, but you haven't achieved their objective.
I love this group. I've been in a situation exactly like that. We're having very meaningful dialogue. And we'll talk a little bit about success factors, how you really achieve it. And then someone says, well, you're not going to be able to get that success criteria or KPIs because so-and-so and so in communications never plays well with us. I'm like, why are they not here?
Right.
What do you mean? why aren't they here? Why didn't we invite them here? So you're absolutely right. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say a lot of the times we do the strategic workshops or just talk about it, we do everything without having the funding available. So it's basically a giant group think on all this great stuff we'd like to do, and then leadership or management says, okay, we'll see how much money we can get to do this. So in a lot of cases, you end up wasting time talking about stuff that you're never going to get to do because there's no funding to begin with anyway.
Exactly. That's why I definitely put this here. I ran into that situation myself.
I ran into the generated enthusiasm. I'm a builder, and I've had instances where one person was all in on the project and the other one was just dragging their feet.
Right.
And not communicating, maybe led to a divorce in the middle of construction.
Nolan's laughing because he got through it. But I had a situation inside of the strategic workshop. A key compliance manager is sitting there, and her peers are asking her for feedback on things that they were deciding. And she was saying nothing. It's the most bizarre thing I've ever seen, ever. Right. And so during the break, I went over to talk to Robin, and I said, hey, Robin, during our interview, you had a lot to say. Is there something, is there a dynamic here that I need to know about? Because I can maybe sway the conversation a different way if you're not comfortable in this setting. She said, no, that's not it. That's not it. I think this is good. This is the right thing for us. 2 weeks into the project, Robin takes a new role. She gave us the signs. She wasn't enthused. Her mind was elsewhere. She checked out, right? This is a good way to see who's in and who's not, so you know exactly where you got to put your energies, right? Anything else before I move on?
I think sometimes we have these signs, like you said, but we ignore them.
Mhm.
So instead of keying in on that, we just said, oh, it's going to be okay, or we hope it resolves itself. But we do need to address those issues or address those signs, because they do hold keys that will reveal later, be revealed later.
Absolutely.
One of the challenges can also be when you have the virtual teams and you have people all over the place and you're just doing it by conference calls. It's hard to read body language and engagement. So, you have to come up with different ways of, making sure people are engaged.
I absolutely agree with you. And when I do this, I ask my sponsor or sponsors, when I do this workshop, fun so that everybody can be there. And I know there's sometimes you can't avoid it, but I will push it back a week just to make sure I can shake a hand and look someone in the eye.
Yeah, I've been in situations where strategically we have this workshop that all looks great, and the leaders are all there, and they're like, you can have somebody from Sam's team, and you can have somebody from Gail's team. And if you don't talk to Sam and Gail, they're like, we're too busy.
Right.
You can have a contractor
Right.
who doesn't understand about what I do, will be real successful.
It's really hard to work with folks that don't have the appropriate domain expertise,
Yeah,
right? All good points. All good points.
yeah.
A quick
Sorry.
question before you move on. When you hold this, do you actually go back after, like depending on the length of the project, do you actually go back and touch base and say, listen, this is what we talked about, like if there's scope creep or change in directions and stuff like that, and say, hey, listen, this is kind of what we had initially?
I do, and I do. That's the short answer, but I want to come back to that. And then when you see the things that I do, I want you to let me know if you've tried it, and I'll tell you some examples of how it's worked for me. But absolutely.
Okay, sure.
Listen, the best project managers, the best program managers, it's not just execution, it's follow through, right? It's follow through. I never leave something or a solution with someone and don't go back and ask them, did it work? Are you getting the value that you thought you were going to get out of it? If you want to create the right brand for yourself, right, we have to do that follow through component. And it helps your reputation, and it helps you truly show that you've realized the value that you set up front. But we're going to go and talk about some detailed steps and follow through. So keep me honest on that. When do we hold the workshop? We need to do it when you have a project that has a huge budget or has a distributed workforce, right? You want to do it when there's absolutely complex components to it, whether it's technology or the fact that it's the distributed workforce. You want to do it when there's a ton of interconnectivity and dependencies between either the entities within the business or even outside of business. They might have some dependencies outside of your core business. When the change impact is high, you better do this. Michelle knows. Compliance and regulatory imperative. You absolutely want to do it in this situation, right? And this is the one I like the best, when it's been tried before and it didn't work. I know, how many of you had to pick up someone else's problem child? We all have, right? So these, I highly recommend, if your initiative meets any of these criteria, not all of them, just any, I would suggest that you do it. So we're going to talk about the 3 steps in actually doing this: the preparation, the execution, and the follow-up. his power.
It says it's the end of the slide.
Try it
you
one more
can,
time.
you don't.
Okay, yeah, there we go. Let's try it again. That's
Do
weird.
it again, see where it goes. Go forward one more.
There it goes.
There.
Oh, that's backwards.
The other-
Go the other way.
Go
the other way.
forward and then go.
One more.
Let's see what happens.
See if it
Hit it
happens.
again.
See if it dies at the next one.
Now hit it again.
Well, we'll keep going while you're working at it. Let's talk about pre-planning steps. As a planning activity, I try to interview as many key stakeholders as I know, right? Because usually that gives me a sense of if there's already an agreement and there's already been a lot of discussion before I've gotten there and some consensus building. It's pretty evident if you talk to those folks individually. And what I also find is you're going to get things out of those individual conversations that you're probably not going to get in a group conversation. So that's important. I also try to define the strategic and program goals from those conversations. And usually that helps me create a draft set of success criteria, KPIs, and success factors. And we're going to talk about that. That is the component of a strategic workshop that I think is different from any kickoff meeting that you typically have.
So how do you sell, I know you can sell the importance of it, but sometimes they are like rapid assessment. Get in here, get us going. How do you slow them down long enough for you to do your due diligence?
I asked them, do you want to pay for it now or you want to pay for it later? And generally that gets people's attention. Most folks, most sponsors have tried this and have mistakes and failures and had successes. And if I ask them about the attributes of their successes, I ask them how much pre-planning was done. And they generally will side with that. And your question is valid because everybody knows the dynamic world we lived in is what can you do for me yesterday, right? What have you done for me already?
That's the last slide.
We'll try to get back on target. We're talking about pre-planning steps. I mentioned the interviews. I mentioned walking through the defining of the program goals as we understand them. I think it's also good to make sure you have an inventory of the work streams, the defined scopes of work, and who's going to be responsible for those pieces. So a project inventory and their descriptions and individuals who are going to own those work streams is important. Determine who is leading and sponsoring each project. You may have different funding sources. They may not all be from one particular funding source. So that's a list of key stakeholders, and the roles and responsibilities would be the output of that. You want to clarify high-level expectations. To your point earlier, you want to differentiate between the interim solution versus a long-term dream state and make sure that what you're doing is very realistic with all of the constraints that are in front of you. You want to determine if there are any funding gaps, right? We talked about that as well. So you want to make sure you have your forecasted project spend to the best of your ability out there and see if you can get any reaction to it. So these are all key components, and they all have deliverables that you can create before you even go into your planning session with the stakeholders. So the key outcome of all of that activity is that you come out with your workshop goals, your agenda topics, and any questions that you need to have answered before you get started, right? And then the ultimate thing is that it helps you create your agenda.
One of the things that I found, especially if you're in IT doing software development in a large enterprise, is also knowing those people to go to that would know about upcoming enterprise efforts that could change the way you go about your project, maybe design changes or different things, different software changes and such, that you can meet with regularly also to keep apprised of things that could impact your project long term.
Are you sure you didn't read my presentation beforehand? He might actually have the presentation. No, that's exactly right. We'll talk about that too. Is one of the follow-up situations is because business is so dynamic. You're moving. You're like, oh man, I have a kickoff meeting. I got everybody enthused. I got money. I'm going to be successful. You do your follow-up routine to check to make sure everything's good. And we'll talk about having a steering committee and what that really means and what you need to do with them instead of just giving them reports. And Joe says, Lee, I know you guys are doing XYZ, but it sounds really similar to something that Mary is doing. I'm like, really? Why are we doing these redundant activities? Let me go talk to Mary. Oh, Mary, you're doing what? You just took 6 weeks out of my scope. Can I use that is that going to be, are we using the same data set? Yeah, can I use that? Absolutely. We'll be done next week. 2 conversations saved me $300,000 and kept me on schedule, right? So we'll definitely get to that, but that's a clear example of something that you want to do. So that was planning. I'm jumping through, guys. I wish you had the slides. But let's talk about, here's the most important part that I think really distinguishes a kickoff meeting from a strategic workshop. It's very nerve-wracking to have those key individuals at such high levels of the organization not be on the same page about what success looks like, right? And so me putting together 4 thematic success criteria to play back to them in this workshop took up 3 hours of the workshop in the first day. And I actually enjoyed that. For some of them, it was a very frustrating exercise. And you have to be careful, right? Because you can have an influencer in the room who, once they say something, everyone coalesces to, right? You can have folks like Robin that I mentioned before that won't say anything, which may be good for you to know and pick up. So you really have to be careful how you drive that. But every time I do this, it is the most meaningful portion of the process. And it's the most important portion because out of that, I find out what success looks like and get everybody agreeing to it, getting consensus. I end up getting measurable KPIs so that we can actually see that the change that we put into the organization actually was realized. And then I understand what I'm calling success factors, like what it's going to really enable us to achieve those KPIs. And those success factors, 9 times out of 10, go onto my risk register. 9 times out of 10, what they're telling me that I'm going to need to be successful is really going to be a constraint for me, and I end up having to mitigate against it. Believe it or not, it's a weird paradigm. You're thinking success criteria, you're thinking very positive, right? And I'm like, I go back and I run into a hurdle. I'm like, man, they mentioned about the ability to have my own sandbox. It's going to be a part of my success criteria. And when it took me 8 weeks to go get one, my schedule's already shot. So listen for this. It's a very important exercise. And we don't give handouts, do we? Because they would have the actual of the presentation. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. I would have brought you guys some. But these components are really important. So let me define success criteria for you first. Ears are good. Success criteria are the realistic. Rhonda? I think Rhonda read it too. Realistic and measurable goals that define what a successful program looks like and are tied to an organization's strategic objectives. All right, that's what a success factor is. KPI are the metrics that let you gauge performance relative to those success criteria, right? And success factors are the critical resources or activities that are necessary to achieve the success criteria. So how do you actually get to the organization's strategic objectives? Most times leaders tout them at the start of the year or the start of their fiscal year. So they're usually pretty easy to find. The funny thing is how many people actually know them and live by them, right? And then even if they know them and call themselves living by, are they really in consensus about that that's really what it should be? So that's the important part of the exercise, is truly understanding what the strategic objectives are. If you do that, you get consensus, you build the success criteria, you define the KPIs, and then you understand your success factors. And I had some samples for you, but we'll just skip on to the next part, which is looking at an interim versus a long-term solution. What I do is, once I get them to have consensus on the success criteria, I'll put them up in big stickies. We'll have them up there. And then I go, okay, these are pretty lofty. What are we doing in the short term? What do we need to do? There's a difference between need and want, right? And I really make them draw out what has to happen in the interim versus something that they maybe are gold plated and can wait later. So that realistic expectation is a big part of that exercise. So make sure you understand the interim versus the long term. Absolutely. Right away. Yes.
So we talked about this is all occurring in the workshop?
Yes.
So, in the case you have stakeholders or whoever you're going to, and you're too high level, and you don't have the luxury of spending 3 hours or 5 hours or a full day in a workshop. I guess maybe you touched on this before, you're interviewing them ahead of time, and then you're coming there with the goals that you collected feedback on, right?
Yes.
Because I have these types of programs and things, but I can't expect stakeholders to spend much less than an hour coming to an agreement.
I understand that it's a challenge. But I'll go back to your question about how do you overcome that. And it usually works for me. I haven't had it not work for me. And when I say to them, are we going to pay for it now and require it? Or when I'm midstream in that, if we avoid it and I'm midstream and then someone raises their hand and not happy with where we're going and we have to start over or we lose something, when do you want to pay for it? And I generally get consensus to go ahead and do it. And it's hard. I'm not understating the logistics of getting those folks in a room at the same time and keeping their attention and having some ground rules that they live by in order for you to get through this exercise and make it valuable. It is not, I don't want to understate that. It's not easy. It's hard. But we get paid to do the hard things, right? We do. So if you put things into, I like to take the emotions and the egos out, if you can. If you focus on the work and the money, generally, the folks that you need in the room, they understand that concept. And they don't want to be the person that didn't play well when you were trying to get this right. No one really wants that. And I think because I invest so much time with the individual conversations and I tell them when I leave that conversation, hey, we're gonna have a workshop and I really need you there, and I just don't think this is gonna be successful unless you're present. And I try to gauge like when would be a good time and try to fit that in and get it. It doesn't always work, and I usually tell them if you can't be there, send me your aligned person that is gonna be able to have influence and make a decision when you're not there.
One of the things that I also try to do in these workshops is that not only get the stakeholders there, but I need your SMEs, the people that are subject matter experts, people that are in the weeds to some degree, because they're going to know the nuances that need to be built out throughout this process. So, and I rarely ever have trouble getting a stakeholder into that workshop, that initial workshop. I have more trouble getting those SMEs because they're so busy.
Right.
And they're pulled in so many different directions. But I find getting those SMEs in there
Right.
very important.
No, I think you're spot on. And when I was talking about the project inventory, I probably didn't spend enough time talking about making sure you knew who was responsible. And that's when you normally get, or who you really need to be successful. And that's when you normally get that list of subject matter experts that you need in order to really achieve success. I'm going to skip, we got 5 minutes. I'm going to skip to some best practice of the workshop. Make sure you record key questions that could not be answered during the workshop. Right? Number 1, Number 2, identify roadblocks and dependencies that came up in the workshop. Number 3, document next steps and action items and the owners. Right? These are all things we know. And number 4, confirm the timing of key milestones. Okay?
Can I make these slides available afterwards?
I will. I will
More
also.
time than that too. Isn't it until 4:10?
They-
Did they cut it short or something?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry about that, y'all.
I hate that too.
Let's talk about quickly. Let's.
No, we're studying.
We'll stay until they kick it out. Until they kick us out. All right. Let's talk about next steps. I want to come back to your point, Anthony, because that is so crucial. We talked about follow through, and the best PPMs, we know how to follow through, right? So you have your workshop. You get through all this good information, you've built consensus, you have your success factors, you have your KPIs, you've got your success criteria, you are rocking and rolling. Do you just go straight to execution and not look back? No one would do that. So, publish your workshop meeting minutes. That's the first step you do, because you give people an opportunity to say, that's not what I heard. That's not what I agreed to. So-and-so is not the SME that's supposed to do that. Do that first. You establish a cadence for status reports, team newsletters, and follow-up meetings. You create a steering committee. You follow up on the open action items and outstanding questions that came out of that workshop. You align project resources, to your point about SMEs. You publish an integrated work plan and you execute towards that. You finalize your communications and training plans if you need them. You support your PMs during the execution. I don't know if any of you had a program manager that didn't say anything to you other than give me your status report. It's the worst type of program manager you can be. I want one that's going to sit there, what risk are you facing this week? How can I help you? Who are you having trouble getting to? You want me to escalate that for you? Make sure, if you're a program manager, that you are supporting your PMs. Create and maintain a risk register and an issue tracker. Manage change requests. Conduct retrospectives with key stakeholders after major milestones. Anthony, this is where you were getting at. You have to keep talking. You have to keep talking and baselining expectations. Celebrate your success. Conduct postmortems and track progress against the KPIs. That's the one thing that I think, if we were all honest with each other, even if you were doing KPIs, which I haven't seen a lot of it, but even if you are doing it, some of us get so caught up into the next fire, the next dynamic, that we never really go back and say, did I achieve what I said I was going to achieve? Did we actually move the needle? So make sure you go back, measure your success, prove to them that you delivered what they said success looks like, so you can ask for that extra paycheck. Guys, I'm going to cut it off here. Wait.
You were going to expand on the steering committee.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thanks for keeping me honest. Yes. Depending on the length of the engagement will determine the frequency of the steering committee, but usually no less than monthly. And I don't just go in with a status report. I generally start with my issues and roadblocks and get commitment on who's going to help me remove it. Telling them what we did and what we achieved, yeah, you do want to celebrate your success. I said that, but that's not what I need them for. I need them to remove roadblocks for me. I need them to agree, if they hadn't prior to that, to the meeting, to the actual routine, I need them to agree on what I need to do to get over that roadblock and have consensus of that group of folks that, yes, that's how we're going to remove it for you, and get commitments. In order to be effective PPM, you have to be comfortable engaging the executive stakeholders in that way. The best ones, you don't even have to talk about it. Once they know that you have a problem, they'll jump in and help. but they're not always there. They're busy, right? They're putting out other fires. They got 16 other strategic objectives they're pulling at them. But they will remember you for keeping those things front and center. Because a lot of PPMs, they want to just pat themselves on the back and we're doing a great job, we're good. I can manage the issue. I can manage that risk. I don't need help. Keep the issues in front of that group. That's what they're there for. They're there to help steer. That's what it's called. If you have a roadblock, they need to help you remove it. So I don't engage them with lofty status report. I do that on a routine anyway. They can have access to review it. My primary time I'm spending with them is I have this problem. I'm missing this funding. This me left and joined another company. Who are you going to give me next? It's really a problem solving, most times tactical exercise, but it's so important. And I need their commitment in that routine so that we can quickly resolve them and move on to our next set of goals. Any other questions?